body had been found in highly suspicious circumstances with what can only be described as quite severe head injuries.
Opening my contacts book for the first time to reveal the secrets of what it really takes to be a murder detective.
You get a gut feeling that actually we're going to be here for the long haul. Unless we get some forensic evidence, this is going to be an extremely difficult job to prove.
On the front line, exposing how we solve the most heinous of crimes.
I personally heard the tape and you thought, this is a man who's unhinged.
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The murder of Gary Dean in September of 2018 was one of Barnsley in South Yorkshire's most distressing cases. I'm going to be meeting the senior investigating officer to understand what really happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the methods they used to eventually bring the killers to justice.
My name is Steve Whittaker. I was Detective Chief Inspector for almost 32 years. This was a really, really difficult case where we had to piece together every significant piece of evidence that we managed to find.
Steve, good to meet you. Thank you very much for coming in.
You okay?
So the case we're looking at today is from 2018. Where were you working at the time? What was your role?
Yeah, I was a team investigating officer in South Yorkshire Police, working at the time in the major incident team in South Yorkshire.
So police receive a call. What do you know about that?
Emergency room service.
My deputy SIO was on call one evening, and it was early September. It had been a really hot summer, and I got a phone call that evening to say that a body had been found in highly suspicious circumstances. On the evening of the 6th of September, there was a guy walking his dog, and he heard a phone ringing. Continued to ring and ring and ring. So he followed his ears, which took him well off the trail, down a bank, under a tunnel, down some steps to the edge of a field where, to his horror, that's where he saw a guy dead with what can only be described as quite severe head injuries.
When police first arrive at a scene like this, they need to determine whether the person there is beyond all help or whether there's any chance of life-saving treatment. I'm Andrew Langley. Between 1985 and 2020, I was a crime scene manager for the Metropolitan Police in London. Having established that, sadly, the victim is beyond any help, the area immediately becomes a crime scene.
So the area where where the body was found is a very rural area, is it? Is it a small village?
Yeah, it's a small village called Silkston in Barnsley in South Yorkshire. A very quaint little village. Crime doesn't really happen there. Certainly a crime of this nature doesn't happen there. And where this murder had taken place was off a Trans-Pennine Trail that used to be an old railway line that cyclists and runners and dog walkers walk most days. It was some way off the trail, in a ditch. The initial reaction is, this sounds suspicious, but you're forming a hypothesis there over the phone of, well, actually, has this person been on a horse? Have they been cycling? Have they fallen off and fallen down the bank and that's how they've got the head injuries? Has somebody, a third party, been present and caused these injuries? Or has this person gone there because it's the middle of nowhere and decided to commit suicide or take their own life? My instruction to the detective inspector at the time is, let's treat it as a murder and let's see where this investigation takes us.
You were working in South Yorkshire,
Yeah.
I worked in London, but we all followed the same similar pattern when it comes to dealing with crimes. The police follow a system called the 5 building blocks, and it's steps that officers take at a crime scene to ensure that mistakes aren't made and evidence isn't lost. Are you okay talking us through those, the sort of steps that your officers would have followed there and then?
Yeah, it's quite clear that the officers need to preserve the scene, looking for any witnesses, gathering any evidence, any CCTV, any house to house. Unfortunately, that was very limited in this particular investigation because it was in the middle of nowhere.
As a crime scene manager, you are responsible for all forensic aspects of major crime. Whilst every case and every scene that you deal with are completely different and unique, you still carry out the same functions in all of them. You need to preserve the scene, you need to record the scene to make sure you've got everything captured before anything is disturbed further. When police start to cordon off a crime scene, it's not a question of just doing a 10-metre radius. It's a question of looking at that crime scene and working out how people may have arrived or left. Because it's not just the area that around the body that's of interest, it's how people got to that point and how they left.
Because I was aware of the location and knew where it was, I knew this was going to be difficult. It was quite clear on that night that we had no CCTV, we had no house-to-house, we had no direct evidence, we had no significant witnesses who witnessed anything. So, after 32 years of policing, you get a gut feeling that actually we're going to be here for the long haul. Unless we get some forensic evidence on this job, this is going to be an extremely difficult job to prove.
So one of the priorities would be, we need to identify who this person was. Was that done that night, or at what stage did you identify who the person was?
It was done that night. We were getting phone calls into the police control room from a lady called Caroline Dean. She was phoning the police saying, my husband hasn't come home, my husband's missing, I'm really concerned. She'd been trying the phone, asked the neighbours could they see him in the house, they couldn't. She came home from school early and she noticed that the front door was unlocked. She went into the house and she saw that breakfast rolls and some bacon were uncooked and uneaten. And so it really identified quite quickly that the deceased was Gary Dean. So I think it was quite clear that Gary, who was a creature of habit, would go out in the morning, he'd go for a walk, he would then come home and have some breakfast. He'd clearly not come back from his early morning walk. One of the most distressing roles a police officer can have to do is to inform somebody that their partner, their husband, is dead. So that evening, family liaison officers went round to the house and spoke to Gary's wife, and he passed the tragic news that Gary had unfortunately died. She told officers that on the morning she left for work, she was a headmistress at the school, she kissed Gary goodbye, and that was the last time she saw him. And she then drove to work. On her way to work, she passed a grey VW vehicle. She thought that was suspicious, really. Because it's a country lane, it's the middle of nowhere, it's very early, and there was a vehicle there with its lights on.
So now you know who the victim is. It's really important to build up a picture of their life. What did you find out about Gary Dean?
Yeah, I think it's best thing to say about Gary Dean, he was a bit of a complex character. His wife described him as slightly autistic. He liked things done in a certain way. He was very into his sports. He was a very keen marathon runner. He'd run the London Marathon about 18 times. He used to like going out on his mountain bike. He didn't work, he stayed at home. He was a house husband, really, for the want of a better word. On the face of it, who just seemed like just an average guy, really nice guy, who'd done nothing to anybody. But as we built lots up around that, we realised that actually there was somebody out there who really didn't like Gary Dean.
When detectives attend a murder scene, it can be really chaotic, it can be stressful, and they're under a lot of pressure. So to help them with that, a system is in place that they can follow. If they use it, they maximise the chances of gaining the evidence they require and minimise the chances of making mistakes.
It's vital that the SIO attends the scene, and they need to agree that strategy with the crime scene manager. And the SIO in this case was Steve Whittaker.
I drove my car there the following morning. I briefed staff and then went to the crime scene. When I got to the crime scene, I was told to go up a track and walk towards where you could see some police tape. I must have walked for 10 minutes before I got to the police tape. And for each step I took, my heart sunk a little bit more, because I'm not walking towards houses, I'm not walking to where I might see some CCTV, I'm still not walking where I'm likely to meet any witnesses. So for every step I took, my heart sank a bit more.
Something you'd use in any crime scene is a common approach path. It's identifying a route that you can preserve, that everybody will use.
I then met the forensic pathologist at the scene and a forensic scientist, and that's when I walked down and that's when I first saw Gary laid there. It was quite clear. He'd got a severe head injury and he'd got marks on his hands and his knees, consistent with trying to crawl away from an attacker. It was quite clear at this stage that it was a homicide, it was a murder investigation.
So what was your purpose of calling the forensic pathologist there?
I wanted somebody to be able to give me a bit of a steer and might be able to tell me, had that body been placed there, or was that body there because the person had been murdered there?
Establishing whether you've actually got your attack site or whether what you've actually got is a dump site is vital, because if it's a dump site, you know that there's an attack site elsewhere and you need to find that, because that's where your evidence is going to be. All the time you haven't identified your attack site, the evidence is in danger of being lost or degraded and contaminated.
Through speaking to the pathologist, I think it was quite obvious then that the person had been murdered at that location.
Was there anything from the crime scene that was identified as an important exhibit that should be taken away straight away?
Yeah, it was quite clear at the scene that there was some slate that was quite sharp around the edges. That had got lots of blood on it. There was some big branches with some blood on it. There was some leaves with blood on the leaves. And we got some earth as well near the scene that had got some blood as well.
Once you've located an item, such as a rock with blood on it, it's not just a question of picking it up and putting it in a bag. You need to locate that item. You need to photograph it, and not just take a picture of a rock with blood on it. You need to locate it to where it is within the scene. Then, of course, you can start to move to recover an item like that and think about the best way of packaging it to ensure that you maximise the potential for any evidence recovery. We've gone from a situation where you needed a spot the size of a 50p piece to be able to get a workable DNA profile, to now being able to get profiles from things that you cannot actually see with the naked eye.
So, in the absence of witnesses, CCTV, I was sat there hoping in my heart of hearts that we were going to get something fast-tracked over that weekend that might be able to identify somebody, a person at that scene who was likely to be the offender. So, having left the crime scene manager and the forensic scientists at the scene to do some work, I then, within 10 minutes of that, was in Gary Dean's living room speaking to his wife. She was extremely distraught. She was there with her family, and it began then to unravel of what was happening.
When you're investigating a murder, one of the important aspects of it that you will be trying to establish is motive. When you looked at the life of Gary Dean, what did that tell you?
It told us that Gary had clearly made an enemy of somebody very close by. And it was told to me in no uncertain circumstances by Caroline Dean. Caroline Dean was saying to me, I know who has committed this murder. The person who's killed my husband is Scott Dawson. We knew at this stage Gary was found dead in a ditch that bordered a field owned by Scott Dawson. I then tasked an officer within the incident room to look everything on our crime management system, on our crime recording system, the 999 calls, any calls that we got that involved the Dawson family and Gary Dean We needed to investigate further so we could paint a picture of what was happening in that community building up to Gary's death. After the forensic evidence had been seized at the scene, Gary was removed and a forensic post-mortem took place. It was quite clear that Gary had died from real catastrophic injuries. He'd been beaten around the head. To some extent, he got fractured facial injuries, fractured skull, and got a broken leg. But really importantly for us, there was a pellet lodged in his spine. Nobody else knew about that pellet. The only person that would have known about that pellet would have been Gary, who was dead, and the offender. So that was a real bit of gold dust for our investigation.
So the pathologists had been to the crime scene, had the luxury of seeing what surrounded the body.
Yeah.
Was there anything within that crime scene that they believed could have caused those head injuries?
They were saying really that that was consistent with a blunt instrument. And again, you make assumptions, but it was quite clear, I think, that what had been used was some slate and some branches.
An important aspect of your investigation would have been to build up a timeline of the incidents that occurred between Gary Dean and Scott Dawson. What is it you learned from that?
It was clear that there was ongoing disputes between Gary Dean, his wife, and the Dawsons. Really a catalogue of quite upsetting, quite traumatic incidents that happened between Gary Dean and Scott Dawson. It was overwhelming, actually, that every time Gary Dean contacted the police, he mentioned Scott Dawson. Every time Scott Dawson contacted the police, he mentioned Gary Dean. This was an ongoing feud that had been going on for years and years and years. Not always a one-way street, really. Gary Dean was charged with making threats towards the Dawsons, damaging some property within the field. He went for trial at Barnsley Magistrates Court and he was found not guilty. In 2016, Caroline Dean woke up at her home address and the car had been vandalised and daubed with the word pedo. In 2017, a letter, an anonymous letter, was written and sent to Caroline Dean's school where she worked, where she was a headmistress, a very good headmistress, well-liked and well-respected in the community. A letter was received there to say that her husband was a paedophile. A safeguarding investigation took place and that was found to not be the case. Some of these very innocuous domestic disputes now became really significant to our investigation. In January 2018, 9 months before Gary's death, Scott Dawson phoned up the police and said they want the police to take some action. Gary Dean has been round the woods. He's setting scarecrows up. He's being mischievous and begging the police to do some action. And what was absolutely quite haunting, really, was that Scott Dawson said, if you don't sort him, I will sort him. When I heard the tape of Scott Dawson shouting and using expletives down the phone, actually, that was quite harrowing. I personally heard the tape and you thought, well, this is a man who's unhinged. We don't always like a motive in a murder investigation, but there was certainly a motive with a capital M in this one.
Police investigations into Gary Dean's life identified the issues he was having with Scott Dawson. So although this provided police with a potential motive, they now needed to find evidence linking Scott Dawson to this crime scene, linking Scott to Gary Dean's body.
Just because somebody had an ongoing issue with somebody didn't give us a power to go around and arrest him. So that was a difficult one that morning, of making the decision of, listen, this guy's entering prime suspect territory, but let's just see what evidence we can gather. From all the intelligence and information coming in, it was likely to be Scott Dawson. But I just wanted to make sure we got enough evidence to secure his arrest. You know, take away some of his liberty, we don't take that lightly. Was there enough evidence for him to be arrested? Was I comfortable that we could take him into custody? But on the back of your mind, you're equally thinking, while that person is out there, are they disposing of evidence? Are they committing further criminality? Am I putting a member of the public at risk by not making that arrest? And that's all the things I had to weigh up on that evening. And, you know, unless you've got something wrong with you, you go home that night and you don't have the best sleep in the world. On the 7th of September, an officer from the investigation happened to be carrying out some inquiries on the same road as Scott Dawson's mum lived, Carol Dawson. While the officer was on that road, he saw Carol Dawson with some pink gloves on, cleaning a grey VW, cleaning what looked like just solely the front passenger footwell. He thought it was odd, extremely odd. So my suspicions around Carol Dawson became heightened.
And what is it you suspected she was guilty of?
I believed at that stage, possibly assisting an offender. Had she driven her son there that morning, had she then assisted him by driving him away from that scene? That was my gut feeling. So the picture against the Dawsons were coming more and more concrete, I think is the best way to look at it, is that Scott Dawson now was certainly a person of interest, and later on that evening I nominated him as a suspect on suspicion of murder. And due to his mother's actions, I needed to nominate her as a suspect for assisting an offender. And then I wrestled with the decision, do we arrest him now, or do we come on Saturday morning and arrest him then? And you wrestle with that as an SIO, and an SIO is quite a lonely place. But I made the decision to arrest Scott Dawson for murder and his mum, Carol Dawson, for assisting offender the following morning.
So when you arrest somebody for a murder, it's not just a case of just taking them out of where they are and to the police station. That house, wherever they are, then becomes a crime scene, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So then you've got 2 crime scenes to manage. You're asking uniformed officers to sit there and safeguard those scenes. We then had a 3rd scene there as well, because we'd got a warrant as well to search the farm building and the farm fields that backed on to the wooded area where Gary Dean was found murdered. So we'd got 3 scenes to search.
What was it specifically you had been looking for?
Well, certainly I was looking for an air rifle or a pellet gun. I was looking for any pellets. I was looking for any evidence that would link Dawson to the murder of Gary. And there was some real unusual things recovered at both those addresses.
Such as?
In the address of Scott Dawson, there was a photograph of Gary Dean that had been printed off, I think it was his Facebook profile. Again, unusual behaviour to print off somebody that's gone on to be murdered in a field next to your field. And then there was some other items found at Carol Dawson's address, which was a tin of pellets. But this is a mass manufacture of pellets. It was a little bit of good circumstantial evidence, but it wasn't anything that was going to nail the case shut.
When people are arrested for offences and they're interviewed, there's often a mistaken belief in what police are trying to achieve. We're not trying to get a confession out of someone. That's not the purpose of an interview, is it?
No, absolutely. The purpose of interviews is for us to put evidence to them and let's see what their reaction is. You know, these are interviewed under caution to know that what they say will be given evidence at court. And that's why a lot of defendants decide to say no comment. In this stage, Scott Dawson did speak to us, and lots of things he said then began to trip himself up. He was at the field on the day that Gary was found there. He never thought to inquire, he never came forward, he saw a cordon next to his field, he never thought it was important enough to come and speak to the police. Why should he, was his answer. He denied ever owning a pellet gun, never shot pellets, and he was just very vague and a bit belligerent, really. Upon his arrest of him and his mother, at his mother's address, we found a mobile phone. This was the mobile phone belonging to Scott Dawson. During the interview, Scott Dawson told us on that day he dropped his phone in a fire, then ran over it with a JCB and decided to bury it. That caused him then to go out and buy another phone from a supermarket. Again, all very odd. Of all the days you could have dropped your phone in a fire and run over it with a JCB and buried it, was the day that Gary Dean was found dead next to his field. Again, he tripped himself up because he didn't get rid of that phone. That phone was at his mum's address. Carol Dawson, she wrapped herself up that much in lies that she ended up no commenting. You don't often get 75-year-old ladies making no comment on an interview. Whilst in custody, it's a phone call that no SIO wants. I got a phone call from the crime scene manager who said, "Steve, I've got some bad news for you. We've done some tests on the slate that was found there and some blood at the scene, and the only blood or DNA on that is that of the deceased, Gary Dean." So it was a real blow for the investigation, a real blow for me and a real blow for the team. We knew then at this stage that the two offenders were going to have to be released on bail. Upsetting, disappointing.
In an ideal world, you'd have had the evidence there and then that weekend to go to the Crown Prosecution Service and ask them to consider charges for the murder of Gary Dean, but you didn't. So now your job was to find further evidence. Is there anything else that came in those early stages?
Yeah, we got some intelligence that came through to us that caused me to raise a warrant for a further search of Carol Dawson's bungalow. As a result of that, we found some notes in Carol Dawson's bin. Clearly ripped up notes into very tiny bits of paper that showed that somebody in that address had been writing. There was one significant word within that said the word pellet. So the word pellet was written on a piece of paper thrown in the bin. So it's all coming together. How did Scott Dawson know about these pellets? We'd not told him about that at that stage. There was also a notepad found. The notepad had got some indentations on it. So we sent that notepad away to be forensically examined to see whether the forensic scientists could decipher what had been written on the previous page that had now been destroyed. The Dawsons were both bailed out. That creates all sorts of difficulties for us as an investigation team. We're working against a bail clock. But within that time, we gathered quite a lot of intelligence. We did a lot of work around his phone. Incoming and outgoing calls, text messages, and where that phone was on a signal throughout its time prior to the murder. What was significant was he would phone his mother once, twice a day. On the day of the murder, he phoned his mother in excess of 20 times. And it showed on that day that his phone was there or thereabouts early in the morning, consistent with Scott Dawson being in that field at the same time as Gary Dean. We then went on to look further afield with the phones, and we looked at Scott Dawson's girlfriend's phone, which had got access to the internet. In that phone, there was two crucial pieces of evidence that we found. One, we saw that Scott Dawson had been looking to buy a pellet gun in the May of 2018, some 4 months before Gary was killed. Scott Dawson had been in contact with a man selling a pellet gun, an air rifle, online. I directed officers to go and speak to the owner of the pellet gun, and he said, yeah, back in May, a man did come to buy an air rifle off me and described almost to a T Scott Dawson.
And this comes back to the importance of getting people to commit to a story within an interview, trying to get an account from them that you can then test. Because in Scott Dawson's interview, he denied ever owning an air rifle.
Absolutely. Certainly an interview from Scott Dawson said he'd never owned an air rifle. And lo and behold, we got him purchasing one 4 months before Gary's murder. So again, fantastic evidence for us. Also on that phone was an internet search where 3 days before the murder, that phone had been used to search for the school that Gary Dean's wife went to. Was the school open that week? And what time did the school open? Again, this was all part of the prepping, the planning. They wanted to make sure that Scott Dawson was alone in that field with Gary and there wasn't going to be any interruptions from his wife. And I knew we had a really good case now at this stage.
An area of forensic science that investigators into Gary Dean's murder utilised was QDE, Question Document Evidence. What this is a forensic science that looks at handwriting to establish whether they can say a person wrote a particular document.
Criminals are very aware of the DNA that they leave nowadays, but they're very unlikely to understand the importance of their handwriting. My name is Emma Bache, and I'm a graphologist, which means that I analyse people's personality through their handwriting. Now, in 2017, 1 year before the murder, an anonymous letter had been sent to the school that Caroline, Gary's wife, worked at, saying that she should be fired because of her husband's involvement with possible paedophilic activity. But a handwriting expert was able to compare the anonymous writing to Carol's handwriting and to see that it was written by the same person.
Investigators also used ESDA testing, where they can enhance indentations in paper.
Even when their actual handwriting hasn't been left, if the author of the writing has written on a pad of paper, for instance, this can be enough for a forensic scientist or a graphologist to see who's written it.
Having sent off the pad and waited some weeks and some months, we now had a result that had come back from that pad that was quite clearly a conversation between Scott Dawson and his mother saying if blood is found at the scene, almost trying to give a defence, writing something along the lines, if blood is found at the scene, it's because we had a fight the previous day.
So Scott used a ballpoint pen to write notes to his mother. A ballpoint pen is quite good because actually it would leave far more of an indentation than either an old-fashioned ink pen or a rollerball. Also significantly in this case is that the pad of paper used was lined, but it was also of quite a cheap, thin quality, so that the indentations could be more easily seen.
They were writing down answers as to the questions they thought we were likely to ask them at the next set of interviews. So it was really, really good evidence and quite damning evidence for the Dawsons.
So both Carol and Scott probably thought they were being quite clever and dodging the police, any police evidence that they may have left, by actually destroying the handwritten top copy of what they'd written. But because they'd been written on pads of paper, the police and a graphologist could see the indentations that had been made in the paper underneath, which of course was a perfect record of their written conversation.
The fact that Scott and Carol Dawson were passing each other notes, talking about the case and how they may try and answer any questions put to them by police. It's an odd one, isn't it? And when I give it some thought, There are several reasons that come to mind. One of them might be that they were just paranoid and they didn't want to talk to each other. And rather than saying these words out loud, they were writing them down on paper. The truth is we will never know, but it certainly was a turning point in this investigation.
We know then we could challenge Scott Dawson on his interview. And we obviously disclosed to him and said, well, you said on your first interview you never owned a pellet gun. Ah, well, yes, I did, I forgot. I did buy a pellet gun, but I'd sold it at an auction prior to the murder of Gary Dean. Again, all inconsistent, couldn't remember who he'd sold it to at the auction, all very convenient. And obviously we put to him at that stage the phone searches, the vehicle being seen, and significantly for us, some CCTV that was recovered from the address opposite his mother's house.
What did that show?
That showed that the day after the murder, Carol Dawson spent 31 minutes vacuuming the front passenger seats of the VW vehicle. She was obviously concerned that she'd picked her son up after he committed murder, and she wanted to make sure there was no forensic evidence in that vehicle.
Circumstantial evidence, I think, is often misunderstood. It's almost as if it's not as good, that you can't convict someone with circumstantial evidence. But many murder investigations are run on that. You're reliant on bringing together bits of information that, by their very nature, could have different explanations. But when they're all brought together, they can make a very strong case.
Yeah, absolutely. You always want that direct evidence, you know, some CCTV, an admission, a confession. But on this case, everything was circumstantial. When you looked at all those different strands of circumstantial evidence, and for me, twisting that together, you knew that you got a really, really strong case. This offence was committed at the beginning of September, and it wasn't until they finally answered bail again on the 15th of February that we were able to charge them. So this was a 6-month investigation. Ironically, and this was purely coincidental, my last ever day in the police service was the 15th of February 2019. That was the day that Scott Dawson and his mum were both charged with murder. We opted for the joint enterprise. She'd not just assisted him, she had been front and central to carrying out this murder. Did she attack him? I don't think she did. Did she take him to the scene and take him away? Yes. Did she vac the car out? Did she try to cover for her son? Absolutely she did. It was actually nice to look at both of them with the whites of the eyes. While I read the charge, they knew then that they were really in trouble, and then that's when they both got remanded in custody. It was a nice way to bow out.
Investigators start to put the evidence together to work out that Gary had been initially assaulted in the corner of the Dawson's field. He'd then gone into the dyke and presumably used the dyke as a means of escape, but he was further attacked along that dyke. Now, the reason that that's so important to find out those details and try and paint a picture, if you like, is that that's the information that the jury are going to have. The jury almost certainly won't go to the crime scene. Certainly, if they do go to the crime scene, it will look very different to how it was when Gary was there. So you're asking a jury who've yet to be picked, you need to tell them the story. You need to paint a picture for the jury so they know exactly what's happened in those last few moments of Gary's life.
So how did the trial go? What was their defence?
The trial lasted for 5 weeks and it took place at Sheffield Crown Court. And their defence was the defence of it simply wasn't us. It was other people. Gary Dean was an unusual character. He was disliked in the local area. Everybody had it in for Gary Dean. It certainly wasn't us.
Steve, you weren't present when the trial was taking place. You'd retired by this point. But you were in contact with your team, weren't you?
Yeah, throughout this investigation, and certainly throughout the latter parts of the investigation, and certainly through the court process. Although I'd retired, it was my last ever job. I'd spent 32 years in the police, and I'd lived and breathed this job for 6 months. I was as keen to ensure that these people were convicted as anybody else. Whilst on holiday, I happened to be in Spain at the time. I was then contacted, the jury have retired. So I spent most of the day and the following day pacing around. So, you know, the trial had some ups and it had its downs, but there was lots of really positive evidence that a jury could rely on. On the 9th of August, almost a year to the day since Gary was murdered, both defendants were found guilty of murder at Sheffield Crown Court, and they got sentenced 3 days later. Scott Dawson received 31 years imprisonment, and his mum Carol received 26 years in prison.
I think for me the important thing around the end of a trial when you've got that guilty verdict is that you've been able to provide some answers for the family. What you always wanted to do was to be able to tell the family what happened to Gary, who did this to Gary, why did it happen, where did it happen. And once you've done that, that's what I always wanted to achieve. Hopefully, the family in this case feel that they've achieved some sort of justice through the sentences that were handed out.
Steve, this was a really difficult investigation. Your team weren't given that smoking gun, and it took dogged determination and what I would call detective work to solve this case. I think it's a real example of what can happen when you get experienced, determined detectives all pulling together, all after the same goal.
Was actually summed up quite nicely by the judge, who thanked the investigation team, including myself, and we all received a Crown Court judge's commendation, which again, they're not handed out that often. So again, that was good recognition from the judiciary that me and the team, we got justice for Gary, for his wife, and for the local community. It was my belief that on the morning of this tragic incident is that Gary had gone out for his normal walk. He went through the field. He was met there quite early by Scott Dawson, and he was shot with his pellet gun to incapacitate him. Then, I believe then that he's then fallen down into the ditch, and Scott Dawson has followed him into that ditch and killed him by assaulting him violently, I think with his fist to start with, and then he's picked up some slate and some big branches to assault him.
Everything that you're telling me suggests to me, on the outside looking, I don't do this job, of absolute premeditation. This was a planned murder. This wasn't something that happened by accident and then, oh no, we've got to clean up after ourselves. All this planning and preparation came before. As you say, that was their intention, wasn't it? In their minds, they were going to kill Gary and get rid of his body.
Absolutely. Their intention was to cause him some serious injury and kill him. And that's exactly what happened on that morning. It's too sinister to even think about. I can't imagine what conversation a son and his mother has in a car when she knows that her son has just snuffed somebody out, taken him away, and what conversation do you have there in the car with your 75-year-old mother? It's unbelievable.
This whole incident stemmed from a neighbour dispute. Neighbour disputes go on up and down the country every day. But that's no justification for the nightmarish way in which Gary Dean's life ended.
As a police officer, as an SIO dealing with lots of investigations, you know, it's unusual to see a murder with this much brutality, really. He fought for his life to try and get away, and unfortunately he didn't. He was left there. He was left there all day and just dead in a ditch. It's a really, really callous, awful attack, probably the worst I've seen in all my years of policing. If I had my time on this investigation again, would I have arrested Scott Dawson the morning after the murder? Yes, I think I would really, to be fair. If I'm going to sit down and be overcritical of myself and my investigation and my decision making, if I was to turn the clock back, I probably would have liked to have arrested him earlier. But it was, had we got enough to arrest him? Just because they've had a fallout, is there enough to arrest him? I think there probably was, to be fair. You know, I'm never not open to criticism. And one of the phrases I would say to my staff, just because I'm the DCI, I've not got all the good ideas.
Ironically, this investigation was given the operational name Operation Special. And I said to the team, actually, this is quite a special investigation that I think most of you will remember for a long, long time.
After an intense 11-month investigation, and thanks to the work of Steve Whitaker and his team and the experts they utilised in this case, Barnsley in South Yorkshire is now a safer place.